In this video, I'm going to introduce you to the layers of RESTful Web Services application that we're going to build and to the objects that are being used in each of these layers. So there are three main layers: presentation layer, service layer, and the data layer. And each of these layers play its own role in our web service application, and each of these layers has its own responsibility. For example, the presentation layer is responsible for accepting information from HTTP request and then passing this information to the service layer. So please note that objects that live in the presentation layer, like for example user model REST object, they do not communicate with the data layer directly. Presentation layer reads information from HTTP request and then it passes that information to the service layer, and it is service layer that performs most of the business logic. And when service layer is done with its work, it will then return information back to the presentation layer, and it will be the responsibility of the presentation layer to prepare information that needs to be returned as a response and sent back as a final response message. So the presentation layer Java code should not be connecting to the database and performing SQL queries directly. The service layer is in the middle, and it will do most of the business logic. It's like a busy worker that does most of the complex work. It will accept information from the presentation layer class, and usually in the form of DTO. In my diagram, it's user DTO, which stands for user data transfer object, and it's really plain old Java object with getters and setters which encapsulate user details. So service layer will then do all the necessary validations, conversions, and sorting and other business logic that needs to be done in this operation. And when it needs to, it will communicate with the data layer to read information from the database or to store information in the database. And when it's completely done with its job, service layer will then return information back to a presentation layer, which will then be responsible to prepare that information for returning it back as a response to an HTTP request. And the last layer is a data layer, which is responsible for communicating with database, for example. So data layer should not be accepting HTTP requests, and data layer should not be sending back HTTP responses, and we should not perform any complex application business logic inside of the data layer. The objects that live on the data layer, they are data access objects, for example, or CRUD repository objects, which encapsulate all the operations that have to do with reading from database, writing into database, or updating database with new records. All the SQL queries that you need to perform, they should live there in data layer, and they should not be found in the presentation layer, for example. Data layer also contains entity objects, and these entity objects, they are also simple plain old Java objects, but with some special annotations that are required for these objects to be properly persisted in the database. These entity objects, they encapsulate information that needs to be stored in the database or information that was read from the database. Please note once again that presentation layer objects do not access data layer objects directly. And please note that entity objects are not being returned back as is in the response to HTTP requests. Entity objects might contain much more details which might be insecure to include in the response and send it back with HTTP response. Each of these layers has its own responsibility, and when your application is organized this way, it is much easier to extend and to maintain your RESTful Web Services application. And in my following videos, I will follow this structure.